Hi, you're watching Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and in this episode of Pandemic Philosophy, I'm going to be talking about the film I Am Legend. Let me start by saying that there are going to be spoilers in this video, so if you haven't already seen I Am Legend and you don't want anything ruined, you're going to want to shut this video off right now, go away, watch the film, and then come back later. For those of you who are still here, I Am Legend is the 2007 film directed by Francis Lawrence. Now, if you've been watching my channel in recent weeks, you'll know that I have a special little affinity for Francis Lawrence because just last week I made a video about Constantine, which is another film that he directed, and it's the film that I consider to be one of the best comic book movies that has ever been made. Here's another little bit of trivia about Francis Lawrence. Apparently, his father was a theoretical physicist. So there you go. Bit of fun trivia for the day. I Am Legend is based on the 1954 Richard Matheson novel of the same name. The novel is actually a lot darker than this film, but it's a very, very important novel because it was hugely influential for writers and filmmakers who work in this particular genre. Guys like Stephen King, Romero, who created Night of the Living Dead. This is a really, really important novel that contributes hugely to this particular genre. This is a novel that has seen several movie adaptations. First of all, there was the 1964 film The Last Man on Earth starring Vincent Price. Then in 1971 came The Omega Man starring Charlton Heston. Then in 2007, the very same year that I Am Legend came out, we had the Asylum Productions B-grade knockoff film starring Mark Dacascos called I Am Omega. Very clever merging of the titles there to try and fool audiences as they walked into video stores into hiring a B-grade rip-off of I Am Legend. And then of course there was I Am Legend. Now, I think this is probably the best film adaptation so far. And what I love about it is the fact that I think it's very accessible. It's a lot less nihilistic. There is a lot more hope than what there was in the original novel. The original novel is its own thing, but I think as far as film adaptations go, I think this is the one that probably just works on all sorts of levels, and for me, it's the one that I really like the most. The plot to this film is pretty straightforward. It's about a guy called Robert Neville, who is played by Will Smith. He's a US Army virologist who is immune to a global pandemic which turns infected humans and animals into violent and base creatures who only come out at night because sunlight harms them. Yes, that does sound a lot like vampires, although this particular adaptation of I Am Legend doesn't really stress that point. It doesn't focus on that aspect of it. It just says this is the particulars of the virus and how it affects those who are infected by it. In this adaptation of the film, Robert Neville spends his days roaming the post-apocalyptic streets of New York City, scavenging supplies, sending out a radio broadcast in the hope of finding other survivors, and trying to invent a cure for the virus. He believes that he is alone until one day he is saved from a violent, marauding horde of the infected by a mysterious woman named Anna. This is a film that I think was a really perfect vehicle for Will Smith. It's a film that needed an actor with presence and with range, and that's what you get with Will Smith. There's no other actors in this film for him to bounce off. There's a couple of brief flashbacks, but the story that we're actually seeing unfolding in front of us in the present day, there's no other actors in that for the first 2/3 of the film. He's got no one to interact with. His dog is there, but he's got no human interaction. There's no one to bounce off of. And so the actor who played this role really had to carry it. They had to bring something that would keep us as an audience invested. This is not an art house movie. It's not a slow burn. It's trying to tell its story in a very compacted, quick, well-paced kind of way. So you need an actor who's got presence, who's going to do all that for you and not drag the film down into boredom, who's not going to lose the audience, and at the same time who's not going to go so over the top that you actually lose interest in what's happening on the screen, and it actually works really, really well. Will Smith, I think, was perfect in this role. There's basically silence for the first 24 minutes of this film. You get flashbacks, but he's in silence, and the only dialogue you hear is from him. It's him either monologuing or talking and interacting with the world around him. There's no musical score for the first 24 minutes. You get snippets of Bob Marley, but The first musical orchestral scoring we hear is 24 minutes into the film, when he's in an apartment doing some scavenging and he opens up a childhood nursery, a baby nursery, and it hits him, the emotional impact of this and what it means. I think it's a very perfectly timed piece of musical scoring, by the way, because it really sort of heightens the impact of the sadness and the stakes and what's really gone on in this world. I think the use of silence in this movie was very, very clever, because what it does is it sets a tone for the isolation. Again, it does this in a very, very effective kind of way. You get a real sense that this is a guy who's on his own. There's no one else around him. He's got his dog with him, that's it, but he's on his own. And the whole sense of isolation, I think you really get the sense of that. Now, that sense of isolation is quite important to the original novel as well, but in this film, I think it's done in a bit more of an accessible way, and it's done in a way that you get all the information that you need to without too many interior monologues, and you don't really need to second guess too much. Obviously, in a novel, you've got the advantage of being able to write words on a page that people read. When you're telling a film story, you can't just saturate the movie with a ton of narrated monologue. That's going to really probably bog things down and ruin what you're trying to go for. There's just enough of that here, that exposition that you need, and there's a lot of visual stuff as well here to show you about this world, to show you what's happened, a couple of flashbacks which gives you everything you need to know, and it's just done really, really well. One of the things I love about this is that right at the very beginning of the film, we are given the explanation for how the virus came about and what it was that caused this pandemic, and it's done in a very simple and clever kind of way with old news footage about a doctor who's created a miracle cure. It's really simple kind of stuff. It does the trick and it works really, really well. And I think Will Smith, as I said, is perfect in this role because he carries the film, and that's exactly what you need in the lead actor for this particular movie. One thing that we do need to talk about though, and it's something that I think lets the film down, is the CG in this particular movie. It is not great, and I think it was a bit of a blight on an otherwise enjoyable film. It's really strange to me because I think of other movies from this particular era, and they don't have that same reliance that this movie does on that, and it does pull you out of the film at times. I felt it's kind of strange because Robert Neville is so present as a human being, but his adversaries and the people he's trying to save, ultimately, they don't actually feel like real human beings, and I think that was a real letdown for this particular movie for me. There's so much emphasis really on the solitary scenes of New York. They're great. You get this sense that he really is alone in New York City, that he's there, he's actually present, there's no one else there. But then when the undead horde arrive, it just, all of a sudden, it's like you're watching a cartoon, and I think that was a real shame. I don't know why this is the way this is either, because Francis Lawrence previously, just only a couple of years prior to this, had directed Constantine, and Constantine does not rely on CG in the same way and was not bogged down by the CG in the same way. So I don't know why this has happened the way that it did. It's a real shame though. It is something that is a black mark against what is an otherwise very, very enjoyable film. Speaking of loneliness in New York City, this is one thing that I think Will Smith actually did a really, really good job of conveying. He really got you inside the head, I think, of Robert Neville and the sense of isolation and loneliness and what that was doing to him as a man. There's something really great about those scenes with the dummies, and he creates tension. It's all Will Smith. I mean, obviously there's some camera angles involved and everything else, but the way that Will Smith interacts with those dummies and the scenes that he has with them, it really gets you inside his head, and it gives you that sense for possibly the sort of the desperation, the loneliness that he has been grappling with. It's very simple and straightforward kind of stuff, but it really, really works well. Those scenes when Ethan and Anna arrive and they're in his apartment and he's got other people in his home for the first time, and it's so clear, it's just so brilliantly done. There's good directing and good acting here, and Will Smith just doesn't know how to be around other people, and it sort of gives you that sense of that. It's sort of the first time in the film you really, really, really get the gravity of what it must be to be a man who thinks he's the only man left on the face of the earth. And the way in which Will Smith plays those scenes, the way in which he interacts with those other characters really, really sells that. And I think in a very, very important kind of way. It makes the film work. Like I said, Will Smith carries this film really, really well. One of the great moments of foreshadowing that I really love in this film happens right at the beginning when Robert Neville is hunting a pack of deer through the streets of New York City. And he comes across this deer that he has stalked. Finally, he's in a position where he can actually shoot the deer and probably take it home and fill his freezer full of much needed meat. And all of a sudden, out of the shadows comes this superior predator, the lion. In fact, it's a family of lions. It's a little mini horde, you might say, of superior predators who capture the deer before he can actually do that himself. And in many ways, this is exactly what this story is about. It's about a man who's alone, who is desperately trying to stalk something. He's trying to find a cure, but this thing is constantly grasped away from him. And of course, it's a superior horde of predators who live in the darkness, who he is grappling with the whole time throughout this story. And the only reason that they are there, of course, is because of human intervention. It's human intervention in nature that caused this virus. It's human intervention in nature which has led to deer and lions being present on the streets of New York City as well. So what are some of the major themes which underpin the mythology of the story of I Am Legend? Well, there's three really: faith, hope, and love. The first one, faith, is something that we see played out in several different ways in the film. For starters, we have this whole idea of faith in science, what you might call scientism. And we see this very, very clearly in the way in which Dr. Alice Crippen is presented in the film. She has created a cure for cancer, or so it seems. She's reappropriated a virus and she's using that as a vehicle in the human body to destroy cancer. And it seems to be hugely successful. And we put our faith in science and we say, yay, it saved the day. But it turns out it hasn't actually saved the day. Instead, we have got a Frankenstein's monster. We've got Prometheus. We've got Icarus. We've got all of those things wrapped into one. We've got something that is too good to be true. And it turns out that it really is too good to be true. And it's now destroying the human race. We also see this play out with the whole question of Robert Neville and his scientific prowess and the way that he wants to save the world with the scientific giftings and knowledge that he has at his disposal. We'll come back and talk about that more in just a moment because it really speaks to another aspect of this movie as well. But another way in which faith is present in this movie, of course, is the constant presence of God that you see in the story. And you see this played out in the relationship between Anna and Robert Neville. Now, it's a little bit underdeveloped, I feel. It would be great if there was just a little bit more meat on the bones there, but you get the basics, and it's pretty straightforward. He is someone, because of the suffering and the darkness that he sees around him, who has clearly fallen into atheism. He's a guy who thinks, no, God didn't do this, we did this, there is no God here to save us. I've been striving and striving and striving all this time to come up with a cure. I couldn't do that. Why would a loving God visit such an awful plague or allow such an awful plague to be visited upon society? Why would a loving God not allow me to find a cure to this? He is a very nihilistic and broken man in this regard, whereas Anna has a lot more hope, and she looks at the world, and even through the darkness and the suffering, she says, there is still a plan, God is still in charge. And you see this, as I said, this whole question of faith and suffering and everything else playing out in the relationship between the two characters. You see lots of visual symbolism of this. There's a great little snippet when Anna is saving Robert Neville from that horde on the pier, and you see hanging from the rearview mirror of the car, there is a set of rosary beads. Another great example of where rosary beads were used to great effect in a film is the movie Gattaca, and it's a very, very important little snippet of rosary beads as well in that movie, and it also speaks to this question of faith. Then, of course, there is the recurring symbolism of the butterfly. The butterfly is present throughout the entirety of this movie and keeps recurring over and over and over again. And that starts right in the very opening scenes of the film when Robert Neville is driving through the streets of New York City all by himself. And he rounds a particular corner and he drives past a wall. There's a brief little shot of it, and we see that there is a poster stuck on that wall. And what's on that poster? None other than a butterfly and the statement, God still loves us. And then that theme of the butterfly, the symbolism of the butterfly, keeps recurring throughout the movie. We have Robert Neville's daughter, when we see that flashback scene and she's in the car with both of her parents. They're trying to get out of New York City as the viral outbreak starts to unfold, and she makes a butterfly with her hands, and she says to her parents, she's sitting in the back seat, and she says, look, it's a butterfly. But they both scold her because they're obviously quite worried about the virus and trying to get out and save their daughter probably and get to safety. And so they both scold her and tell her, look, just quiet, mummy and daddy are thinking, that kind of thing. And they don't see the butterfly. Now that's an important moment, because that is also really one of the big themes of this film. Do we see God at work? Do we actually see and hear, or are we only seeing and hearing what we want to see and hear because we are so consumed by our fears and our sufferings and our worries and all those kind of other things that plague us on a day-to-day basis? Are we actually failing to see the work of God? Are we failing to hear his voice, that little still small voice, in the way in which he works in the world? And that's a theme in this film, and it starts right there. The daughter makes another butterfly later on in the film. Again, this is a flashback scene. There is the butterfly tattoo, which we see on Anna's neck towards the end of the film. Then, of course, there is the butterfly pattern which appears in the glass as it begins to shatter as the undead horde are attacking, and they have broken into Robert Neville's house. They are down in his laboratory. Robert, Anna and Ethan are behind the plexiglass, the last place of safety and refuge that they have in the building. And the undead horde are just ramming at that glass. And of course what happens is a butterfly pattern emerges as the glass begins to shatter. Why would this be so important? Well, for those who don't know, the butterfly is a symbol of resurrection. It's long been a Christian symbol of resurrection, actually, but you have this whole idea of a caterpillar which goes down into a grave, if you like. It goes into a cocoon. There's a state of death, quote unquote, and then there's a resurrection. The whole idea of the butterfly, something beautiful and glorious that comes out of something that seems sort of pretty ugly and mundane, really, when you think about a caterpillar and what it is, but it becomes this beautiful thing. But to achieve this beautiful resurrection, it first has to die to self, in a sense. And so that imagery is put to good use in this film. And again, it's a very recurring theme that we see in this. Now, this is quite important because obviously it's trying to say something about faith and God speaking to the world in the midst of suffering and evil, and us probably not listening or not seeing that, not grasping the full plan. We are maybe like the caterpillar who looks at his world and doesn't quite realize that there is a resurrection coming, and that he's going to be resurrected into something more beautiful, and there is something good unfolding around him, even though it might not feel that way. But also, this is the way in which Robert Neville's story in this movie unfolds as well. Basically, it seems to me that this film is trying to tell us that there is always hope, and it's a recurring theme here. Even at the very end, when the zombie horde is attacking and it seems like all is lost, guess what? A butterfly appears in that broken glass. The butterfly appears to remind us there is still hope. All is not lost. Now, what's interesting is this really speaks to Robert Neville's story and his character arc in this movie. The whole idea that there is still hope, and that just like the butterfly, he has to go down into the grave, and then there will be a resurrection of sorts. And this is the whole thing of him being the saviour. He can save the world, but what is required is sacrifice on his part in order for that resurrection, that salvation of humanity to actually come about. As I said, this theme of Robert Neville as the saviour is a very interesting one, and it's in this film as well. Right at the very beginning, when he opens up his fridge, again, it's just a passing shot, but you see a Time magazine cover with Robert Neville on the front of it, and what's written on that Time magazine cover? It's got one word. It says saviour, ? And that really is the question that this film is exploring. Is he really the saviour of humanity or not? And it turns out that he is, and you can see this throughout the film, interestingly enough. He's kind of a very messianic character when you think about it. He's incorruptible. He's this person who is without the sin, if you like, of the virus. He is incapable of being corrupted by it. He is the cure, and his blood in particular is the cure. Now, if you know anything about Christian theology and Christian doctrine, you will understand straight away why this idea of a Messiah who is without sin and who cures the world through his blood is quite central to Christianity. Now, of course, we also see something else interesting playing out in this film, and that's the fact that the horde, the world, if you like, refuses to accept the cure. They see him as the enemy. They are stuck in a cycle of self-gratification. Their base desires are the only things which drive them, and they can't escape from that. Again, it's not hard to see what's being played out here, but the big crescendo moment, if you like, and this really speaks to the other major theme of love, is this realization that the cure can only come through self-sacrifice, through embracing the cross. And we see this through the fact that in order to save the world, he hands off the blood with the cure in it to Anna and to Ethan. He hides them in that little furnace thing in the corner, and then he has to take the grenade and face down the undead horde. This is the butterfly moment. This is the cocoon moment. Everything goes down into the world of the dead, if you like, and then there's a resurrection on the other side of this. There's something also interesting about this idea of fire as a purifying thing. This is a very Christian theme, again, this idea of our works and the things that we do being tested by fire. And fire is a purifying agent. You know, precious metals that are burnt up and tested in a blast furnace, if you like, and so you end up with something even purer out the other side of it. So the whole idea of fire, and fire is related to the idea of suffering, and suffering as a sort of a test, if you like, and his works are literally burnt up. And the only thing that remains at the end of all of that is the thing that really matters, the thing that is actually going to save the world, the thing that is truly pure and which is good. That is what comes out of the ashes of that purifying fire, that purifying test that he undergoes. And of course he succeeds because he embraces self-giving love. It's self-giving on his part, which is the pathway to redemption for humanity. All in all, I think I Am Legend is a really, really great film. It's a very accessible post-apocalyptic pandemic movie because of the fact that it doesn't ever get too dark or brooding or barbaric. If you stop and think about the world in which Robert Neville inhabits, this would be a pretty awful and harrowing kind of place to live, but the film doesn't ever drag you down into that so much that it becomes inaccessible. This is a movie that you can watch with older children. It's very accessible in that regard. And it touches on some important themes, like the whole idea of human community and loneliness and isolation and how destructive that is to the human person. That's touched on in this film. There's these great scenes, as I've mentioned earlier, with the dummies, where you get that sense of why human community is so essential, why we shouldn't be alone, but it never gets so dark and so nihilistic and so bogged down in that aspect of the story that the film starts to become inaccessible. It's really not so much a horror movie as it is more of a supernatural thriller, if you like, a supernatural fantasy story. And I think there's something really great about that because of the way in which this film is so accessible and the way in which hope is always an ever-present reality. It's the big theme in this, the whole idea of hope, the butterfly which will rise again from the cocoon. The film is let down by the CG though, and it's one of the things that for me is frustrating. However, once you've got your head around the fact that the CG is not what it could be and that it is a bit of a letdown, I found that when I watched the movie again on subsequent viewings, all of a sudden it wasn't the distraction that it was first time around. I was able to actually immerse myself in the story and enjoy it because I knew that this was just the reality and my expectations were tailored accordingly. It's a shame though, it is a shame because it is a bit of a letdown to this particular movie. There are things that perhaps could have been there that are not there, a little bit more of the whole question of Anna and Robert and their relationship and the whole philosophy around atheism. It's a little bit underdeveloped, I think, in places, but I guess the trade-off is that it actually tells its story in a really well-paced and really compact kind of way. It never hangs around too long. You never get bored watching this movie. It just gets straight to the point, really. And I have to say I enjoy that about a film. It's kind of refreshing to have that where everything that's happening on screen is happening for a reason and it's constantly driving the story and the characters forward. I really love I Am Legend. It's not the greatest pandemic movie that's ever been made, but it's definitely a really, really solid and enjoyable outing, and I highly recommend it. Thanks for watching this video. If you're not already a subscriber, please hit the subscribe button and don't forget to hit that little notifications bell as well. If you enjoyed this content, then please support the channel. You can do that using the PayPal link below. If you want to make a one-off contribution because you enjoyed this particular video, you can do that using the PayPal link in the video description. There's also a PayPal link found at the top of my YouTube homepage. Alternately, you can become a regular patron by supporting the channel with a regular contribution on Patreon. That's patreon.com/leftfootmedia. As little as $1 a month is all it takes, or as much as you'd like to give. A huge thank you to everyone who is supporting this channel. Without you, today's video would not have been possible. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.